be here. So my name is Mark Greeven. I'm a professor at IMD, and I spent the last 15 years in China, in Hangzhou and in Shanghai. So what I would want to do today is fairly simple. I wrote this book, so I want to introduce my book to you. But I also hope very much that this is a conversation where you have questions, you feel free, you reach out, and every time, I'm happy to. I hope it is an exchange rather than just a lecture. Although I am a professor, so if you do not stop me, I keep talking. Yeah? So it is very simple, and I can talk about innovation in China for ages. So be careful. But I think the place closes at 10, so I think we're done by 10, so it should be okay. So my Chinese name is Ma Ke, so it's very funny. So maybe for some of you, the first Chinese word is Mark, Ma Ke, so it's very simple. I figured, should I do this in Chinese or do it in English or in Dutch? But then I figured, maybe Dutch is not very. Who speaks Dutch in the room actually?
I do.
Oh my God! Twee Nederlanders in de 3 zelfs. Oh kijk aan. Fantastisch. Now that makes me feel at home. Now even so far away from home.
Goed zo.
Dank je wel. So I tell you a bit the background of this book and why I wanted to write this book. So in fact, for my first book, I focused on Alibaba, Baidu, Tencent, sort of the bigger what we call business ecosystems. And I started doing research with them in 2005. And I started actually with Jack Ma. So I interviewed him, and then I felt it was an interesting company, Alibaba. And then I started to do research, and then I built up sort of all the databases, and I spent 10 years studying these companies. And then while studying these big companies, I saw there's so many unknown, smaller, but rapidly growing, really interesting companies that nobody ever talks about. And then I figured, hey, that's an interesting topic to study a bit in more depth, and that was actually the purpose of the second book, is to say, well, we may know Alibaba and we may know Huawei, in particular Huawei these days, right? I mean, thanks to President Trump, everybody knows Huawei. I think Ren Zhengfei will be really happy, except for his daughter being arrested, obviously. And then maybe Haier, so you probably heard about Haier. And in fact, actually, I have a question for you. So, whom of you would consider China a place of innovation, in fact? Okay, so that's a fair amount, yeah. So, because probably like 5 years ago or 10 years ago, if I would ask the same question, so it would be fairly silent. And in fact, when I moved to China in 2005, so at that time my dean, so I was at the Dutch university, he said, Mark, what are you going to do in China? I said, I'm going to study innovation. And he says, see you in 3 weeks. And I never came back, so that was funny. And I left, and then I started working in Zhejiang University. So I worked in a Chinese university for about 10 years, in a Chinese public university, so I was a sort of part of the system, if you like. Teaching in English and also teaching in Chinese to local students and local executives. So and a lot of my work in this book is done with myself, George Yip, my co-author at the Imperial College, and Wei Wei, a local entrepreneur in China. So we have I think done a lot of interesting work, but most of my work was done while I was at Zhejiang University, facilitating also to do this type of research. So. I mentioned Huawei and Haier and Alibaba. What other innovative companies come to mind when you think about China? Tencent. What does Tencent do? WeChat. I hear WeChat, right? Yeah. And what else?
The company, the cameras, Hikvision.
Hikvision. Hey, yes, very good. So there's the smart security cameras. In fact, Hikvision is an interesting company. It is from Hangzhou, and it is the #1 market leader in security cameras. From warehouses, border controls, small stores, including baby rooms. So they're really a very interesting company. Do you know that they have 10,000 R&D engineers sitting in Hangzhou? Only this company. 10,000 R&D engineers. So obviously their cameras are pretty good, right? What else?
DJI.
Say it again?
DJI.
DJI, what do they do?
Drones.
Drones, right. They have a very big market share in consumer drones, right? And there was another company with this now. Somebody mentioned here. Meituan? Yeah, what do they do?
Food delivery.
Food delivery and all kinds of other delivery of services and products, right? So it is, and they also do shared cars and taxis and so on these days, yeah. Meituan actually, do you know that Meituan has a higher valuation than Uber?
Yes.
Yeah, it has a higher market valuation than Uber, and it is larger than Xiaomi. So I think Xiaomi is in Brazil, yeah, from the phones and everything. So I think they re-entered. I think they failed and they came back. So they were like, we cannot miss the Brazilian market, so we come back. So I hope they succeed this time. But we will talk about that because maybe there's also some challenges to Chinese innovators. So for me, obviously, I think today's China is I would say is fairly innovative, especially compared to 10 years ago or 15 years ago. And for those non-believers, if they're in the room, I have some statistics and some numbers, but it's only one slide, so don't worry. And the rest I refer to McKinsey and whoever consultants, what they do. So if you look at MIT's Technology Review, they have a list every year of most innovative companies in the world. The country with the second most innovative companies in the world is actually China. So the number one is obviously, not the Netherlands, the United States. The Netherlands where we don't exist somewhere. And then the second one is actually China. So China has 7 companies on this list. And then the next one is maybe in India or another country with only 1. So really becoming very, very well known. Forbes, they published something called the Future 50, so the most interesting companies to look at for the future. 21 of those companies are actually Chinese companies. So looking at the future, which is the same number as American companies. So again, you wonder, where's Europe in this picture? But I don't know. So we're getting squeezed out, sort of. And then we participated in the study with strategy End. So this used to be, from its privatized corporate. And so we did a study with multinationals, many years. And then actually in the most recent one, 2/3 of multinationals that do or have innovation operations in China, they see their Chinese counterparts as equally or more innovative. So this is, let's say, the Philips, the Bosches, the GEs of the world that do R&D in China. They look at their Chinese competitors and they say, hey, they're equally innovative or even more. So this has sort of cycled through the minds. Now, I think Renatus today referred to unicorns as well, so pre-IPO $1 billion valued companies and ventures. So 50% of those are now coming from China. So it is a very large proportion. Then when you look at new retail, so, there's a lot to talk about retail and new retail, the combination of online and offline. If you're ever interested in new retail, China is really the place to be. It's like a big experiment, like a big lab. And I tell you, we'll see a lot of crazy and interesting things, interesting concepts, and probably half of them will fail and will not make it to next year. But it is this experiment that you can see going on, which is fascinating. So basically it's like, you can sort of look into the future in real life, and then say, this works, this doesn't work, and maybe take some of those things home, to Brazil or any other place. Now, of course, also in terms of technology, China is doing pretty well. So we look at the number of patents, venturing activity, amount of venture capital invested, so what the market thinks, and then we look at specifically fields like artificial intelligence, but also biotech, fifth generation telecommunications technology, genomics, electric vehicles or new energy vehicles. We see really Chinese companies and researchers start to lead the pack rather than follow. So in many cases we'll find a lot of innovations in China which are not new to the world but are new to China, or very innovative combinations of existing things. But in some cases, for instance in AI, in genomics and in renewable energy, we find actually that some of the new things, new to the world, are being invented in China for other parts of the world. And it's very interesting because we see in the same study with multinationals that now slowly the reason why multinationals start to operate innovation and R&D in China becomes more and more not to innovate for China but from China. It's a small difference, but it is a big difference. So it's an interesting world. But all of this, great, fantastic. But my main question remains. So that's today. But maybe it's a hype. So maybe it's because the Chinese government says so. We all know the Chinese government is very important. We can talk about that later if you want. There's no cameras here. So I have my Chinese phone, but I left it at the hotel. So my question is really, so what about tomorrow? So is it indeed the Huawei and the Haier and the Alibaba, maybe Hikvision, or is it? Are these the players for the future? Are they the handful, maybe 20, 30 different companies that define the future of innovation coming from China or not? And actually we should then ask the question first is not only who is innovating in China, but in particular, so is that something sustainable or is it just something that is there today and because everybody talks about it, we all believe it? Now, so I think that we should first investigate the reason, the why. Is innovation as a process, as a phenomenon, persistent and sustainable in China for a long time? If the answer is yes, then it's interesting to look at it. If the answer is no, then we look at it today and we're being opportunistic and maybe we invest and it's fine, but then the end of the story. But the long-term game, as you can feel obviously, is of course the sustainable innovation, which is one of the drivers, by the way, of the trade war, rather than trade. So let's look at this. And I have sort of 3 pictures that I want to show you, which also sketch sort of the context of China. So for those of you that may not be 100% confident about what actually this country is, it's also kind of a summary of the country. So for me, one of the most important features of China is, it's not that the economy is growing. So obviously the economy is still growing. And it was maybe 10%, and then 8, and then 5, and then I don't know. But this number in any case is kind of made up, right? So this number has some sort of reality check, but in fact, usually this number is just a number. The reality is you need to figure out, do people's lives get better? Are there entrepreneurs starting new businesses? How about the prices of food? You have all kinds of indicators whether or not an economy is growing, and China's economy is growing, and it has been growing for a very, very long time, over 30 years. But for me, the growth is not even the most important thing. It's what the growth brings. So China is a place of immense dynamics and turbulence. And just for your reference, so 40 years ago, so let's say the end of the 70s, there was no private sector in China. So there were no entrepreneurs. Yeah, maybe a couple of illegal ones. But let's say 0 or 0.1%. So there was no private sector. So this means at that time, every economic activity in the country was done by the state or by state-owned enterprises. Today, 70% of the economy is driven by the private sector. So 70% of GDP is contributed by the private sector. So you talk about just a 40 years, so basically a generation, that make this China that we see today. So obviously, a lot of things change on the way. And this comes from changing regulations, so from it's being illegal to be an entrepreneur and own privately stuff, to being very much promoted to be an entrepreneur, all kinds of things. But also, who are the competitors? Who are you competing with? It used to be multinational firms in China where, the king and queen of the country, right? They could sell whatever they want as long as it is from Germany or the US. But today that advantage is gone. It's very thin. So today the Chinese consumer says, so why are you better than that? Why are you better than the Chinese version or better than the Korean version or something like that? So competition has changed dramatically. Cost structure. So China is no longer cheap. So labor costs in China are not, in the biggest part of China, no longer cheap. And actually, in fact, a lot of Chinese producers are moving to other places outside of China because it's too expensive to do it in China. So China is very, very much changing. For your reference, buying an apartment in Shanghai for a normal location city center sets you back $20,000 per square meter. So China is not a cheap place. So and that's a lot of change. And of course, what that brings, if you're a company in here, very simple. If you want to survive in a place that keeps on changing so much, where your advantage of having cheap labor is suddenly gone, where your consumers want new things, where competition is changing, and where all those kinds of new regulations keep on going and going and going, you have to innovate. So you have an imperative as a company in China to keep reinventing yourself because the advantages that you had and the conditions that were there to give you that advantage are gone. So in fact, for a Chinese company, innovation is not a question about, I want to make the most fancy phone, or I want to do the most funny thing in an incubator, or I want to start this kind of fancy marketing campaign. It's not about it, it's about survival. And for Chinese companies, and we will give examples later, it is really about, you know the Alice in Wonderland? You know this story? You know the story of the Red Queen? So there's a chessboard, Alice starts running on the chessboard, and then she doesn't move. And then she asks the queen, says, why am I not moving? And then the Red Queen asks, says, well, I don't know where you come from, but in my world, I need to run to stay in the same place. So China is a bit like that. It's like a Red Queen race. So I think that makes, for most companies, you have to innovate. And it's not because of foreign companies, that's not because of Mr. Trump, and it's not because of the Chinese government. It's because of the business reality. Now, of course, having a motivation, that's nice, but you also need the capacity and the conditions. Now, in that sense, China had a very visionary government, I think, and still has a very visionary government that put in place a lot of conditions that help companies that want to innovate. And that is partly because of the nature of the market. It is a very large market, so there's scalability. If you're an entrepreneur, you want to be in a market where you can scale, because then you can make more money doing the same stuff. You want your business model to be able to be copied. So China is a great place. The Netherlands is not. It's a very small market. If you innovate things, especially products, you would like to have the facilities to produce those products as well. Now, China has that advantage. There's a lot of money available. There's a lot of knowledge available. Thinking about talented people. China has about 4 million graduates per year in STEM topics. So science, technology, engineering, mathematics. 4 million per year. Now, I'm not saying that all 4 million are clever people, but if the same percentage of sort of talented people if the percentage is the same in China as in other places, which I'm assuming, it's a very large pool. So you have a lot of money, you have a lot of talent, you have a fairly good system as well when it comes to infrastructure. Because it's very funny, I can go up the mountains in the middle of nowhere and have 4G telecommunications connection. I can actually drive by car to each and every village in the whole country. And China's a big place. I know Brazil is also really big. But it's amazing if you think about it. I can take an airplane to almost everywhere in China. There's high-speed railways, I don't know how many kilometers. Thousands of kilometers of high-speed railways. The US, by the way, has 0 kilometers of high-speed railways. It's very interesting to observe that the infrastructure, thinking about e-commerce, thinking about moving stuff from A to B, in China is in fact really good. Considering it's a large place, minus 30 in the winter in the north, tropical climate with snakes and elephants in the south, with mountains higher than the tallest mountains you can find in Europe. So it's really not, that's funny that we forget that, but it's actually a very, very good infrastructure. And then we have a supportive government, or at least not a government that is inhibiting. So I would say, not in all parts of China, but in most parts of China, especially the coastal regions, starting a business, for instance, is not difficult. It takes very few time and very little money. So all these conditions make, of course, that the private sector, the entrepreneurs can rise and can take the opportunities and can play the role of innovator. Now, so you have the motivation, you have the conditions. So these are two important ingredients for an innovative country. Of course, there's also challenges. So let's not be over optimistic. There's also a lot of challenges, and whether or not it's a relatively weak enforcement of intellectual property rights, overcapacity for many, many years in a lot of industries, maybe internet control is a limitation. I don't know these days. So if I reflect on internet control today, after all the scandals with Facebook and everything, I'm not so sure if internet control is a bad thing. So maybe it's about what happens with the control, or who gets the control. I don't know. But at least it is a limitation in terms of the flow of information, which is limited. And normally speaking, you would want for innovation to happen that information and knowledge can flow freely. Now obviously that's not the case in China. So I would say in one word, you could say it's a fairly closed innovation system. Now, this system tends to be very big because it's a large country, but it's still a relatively closed system. Now that has all the disadvantages of being closed and not being able to, having different standards, not free flow of information, knowledge, and etc. So I think that's important. So for me, looking at China and innovation, I think we need to realize that we're looking at a box. But what I want to do is, instead of discussing with you whether or not it's a nice box, or the box is bad, or the box's boundaries are not good, I would like to say what is in the box. And then, in fact, I don't really care what the box looks like, because it's there anyhow. It's not going to change. So the box is not going to go away. So then we did this research, and then in the research we find out there's actually 4 different types of companies that we see innovating in China. So 4 different types of players. And in the book it's very nice, it's 4 different chapters. So it's very simple, piece by piece. I like to keep things simple. So the first group of players are well known. They serve mass markets and they're old companies. So incumbents, let's say 30 years old. And so that would be an old company in China because, as you remember, the private sector started to develop only in the end of the 70s. Now these are all famous people. We have Mark Jackson, Jack Ma, and then we have another Mr. Ma from Tencent. Now he became very famous now, Ren Zhengfei from Huawei. Then this is the founder of Haier, so the appliance company, the fridges and everything. That's how we meet. And then we have him, Mr. Li. So he has a company called Geely. Geely is a car company that acquired Volvo in 2010. We will talk about Mr. Li because I think we talk not enough about people like Mr. Li. He's not very good. He's not like Michael Jackson. So he's not somebody that goes on the stage and talks about everything, but he's a fantastic entrepreneur. So we would call them the pioneers, maybe. Like they're early movers, they're already either national champions, in most cases they're global champions in their industries. They're doing really well and they're known, most of them are listed. People outside of China would know them as large players and usually as innovative players. Then there's this second group, which is, they're equally old in most cases. They're also usually 20, 30 years old, but they don't serve mass markets, they serve niche markets. They're a bit smaller. And there's one picture of the founder of Hikvision also on this. So this would be what we call hidden champions. So these companies are in fact not well known, and they like that in many ways. They prefer not to be well known, they prefer to keep the status of being hidden. They're typically companies that would not hire the best students from the best universities. They would hire students from second-rate universities in second-tier cities and then train them really well to become very loyal, fantastic employees. So they have a very different approach to building businesses, but they are extremely R&D and technology driven. And in most cases, I can tell you that these companies play in the top 3 worldwide, but in a very small niche. So for instance, the lady here, I don't know if you know, if you recognize her, most Chinese people will probably not recognize her, but she's the founder of a company called Lens Technology. In fact, she has the world's largest market share in making glass for touchscreens. So I don't know the number, but it should be close to 50% of the total. So basically, it's very likely that your phone has her glass in it. So this is a type of company that you would probably not know of, but they're very, very advanced and they do really, really well. So we call them hidden champions, and about 200 of them. And mind you, for industrial fields, if you would talk to a company like Bosch, they would say, oh, Hikvision, the company of the smart systems, is their main competitor. Well, it's not their competitor because they're completely blown out of the market by this company. So in the niches of the industries, these will be very famous companies. But outside of that, nobody would know. But it's a very interesting group. And then we figured we dig a bit deeper, and then we saw in the same space, that's a very niche, so usually business to business, technology driven or science driven companies, but then we looked at younger companies, so less than 10 years old. And then we saw a group of, a very interesting group, a very large group of overseas returnees, so people that studied abroad, usually in the US or in Europe, and they came back to China to start a business. In many cases, they were in PhDs, in sciences, in engineering, in advanced fields, either working overseas for a while or studying overseas, and they would come back and start a technology-driven venture. And we would call these underdogs because Obviously, these companies are not yet really big, so they're still smaller, but Chinese small. Huh? So a small company could be 1,000 people. Huh? So it's relatively small. They are very bad at promoting themselves because most of them are scientists and engineers. So they care about the product and the technology, but not really about the story, or less. And you get interesting people, and I will give a couple of examples later. But for instance, the guy with the glasses in the middle is a former NASA scientist, a PhD in geoimaging that now uses this technology in China for building solutions for agriculture and precision agriculture and farming. So very interesting, but also very niche. The key thing here is that the number is very big. So we studied this for a fairly long time, and we use a very conservative estimation based on patents, based on venture capital investment, based on all kinds of things. And it should be at least 150,000 of those types of companies. So these are companies with a core technological advantage that are seeping in each and every corner of each and every industry. And they're doing this really based on what they developed. It's their own indigenously developed technology. And I think these are extremely interesting for anywhere in the world because they are just fantastic companies. They're undervalued, so these are good investments. And they tend to be great to partner with. So I think this is a very interesting group that a lot of companies, including multinationals in China, are ignoring. So on average, you would see 1 or 2 investments per year of a large company in China in this type of ventures. While in fact, these guys, the pioneers, guys and girls, I should say, they invest massively in that group. So I think it's sort of a missed opportunity. The problem, of course, is that how do you find them? Because there's almost no media attention, they don't make good websites, if they have a website at all. They're in an industry niche, they're in the business-to-business world, it's not consumer-facing, so how do you find them? So that's the trick. So it took me 10 years, but I'm an academic, so I'm very slow. But maybe if you're a business person, it takes you maybe a little bit less, but still, it is difficult to find them. And then we saw this fourth group, which...
Mark, may I ask a question?
No, yeah.
What is the probability of them surviving?
So a great question, thank you for that. So the probability is to not survive is as large as any other, I would say, venture company. So I would say that probably 90% of them will not would not survive the 5-year timeline. But these are already around for close to 10 years. So the ones that we sort of investigated are sort of the ones that already passed, the first hurdle. But generally speaking, the likelihood that a lot of them still fail is very large, as with every venture. As with every venture, yeah, absolutely. Please.
And there's some kind of policy that try to keep them in the country, or
no.
They just come back because they would like to be in China.
Oh, okay. That's a good question. So you mean the people or the companies?
Yeah, the underdogs.
Okay, so they are, well, there are 2 reasons. So there is a policy for people that have advanced degrees abroad to come back to China, and they would have benefits. Usually this is in the field of taxation or household registration or these kind of things. So yes, there is certainly for probably a subgroup of that, there's a particular advantage. But I mean, they're not stupid. So if it's only for tax reasons, they would not start a business in China, right? So the main reason why they come back to China is because there's an opportunity. Yeah, so that's in most cases the reason. But it's very nice, of course, that it is facilitated by preferential policies, by tax holidays, by all kinds of things. So it makes it easier for them to come back. And from the Chinese government point of view, that was important, because otherwise all those clever people, it's like a brain drain, right? So the most clever people study abroad and they don't come back. Yeah, this is a bit of a problem. So let me go on to the 4th group. Is it okay? And then we pick up. So the last group. So because then the story sort of round. The last group is an interesting group because they are also young companies, but they focus very much on mass markets, and they have a couple of features. They're very different from the upper left group, the underdogs, because they're extremely noisy. They're very good storytellers. They usually, their business model is innovative. Their technology usually is not so innovative. So they would be digital in the digital space. They would find ways to grow very rapidly and use venture capital to fuel that. So to give you an indication, so the guy with the white shirt in the left, so upper left of the right corner, founder of Didi. So Didi is well, you know probably Didi because they're car at 99. So in fact, he got I think he got like, I don't know, 8 rounds of investment or so, and in his 6th round of investment, he got $3 billion venture capital investment in his company. Which is, for your information, if you would put from 1 year all the investments in venture capital from Japan, Singapore, and Israel together, that's less than 3 billion. So that went into one company in one round. So somehow, somewhere, these companies' valuations have become very crazy, but that's not just a small group. I mean, this is a group where we estimate it's about 200 companies that are in this field, so we call them change makers, digital enabled, clever young people in many cases, with innovative business models that use digital technology in traditional industry. So in many cases you would find them operating in education, in healthcare, in mobility, in established industries, but they're using a different mindset, a different logic, using digital technology to grow as fast as they can. Many of them, of course, they don't make money. And so the big question, of course, is, so when are they going to make money? And the key question there is, with every startup in digital and when you're a platform business model, is what is that turning point that you say, I'm going to monetize my users at the cost of getting more users? So the game is usually venture capital pays for your business so that you get more and more users, and at some stage you reach a saturation. But I don't know, in China, if that's at 500 million people or with 600 million people. So in most cases, that is the numbers of users that these companies have. So that is the picture. So they're quite different. They're all innovative, but also they're innovative in a different way. And I think that as a total is a very impressive set of companies that is much more than just a Huawei or higher. So for me, the future of innovation in China is going to be played out in all the other corners, more than only in that handful of 30 or 40 companies that currently succeed. Now, give you a couple of examples, but I promise you it will not be too long. So the pioneers, maybe the most funny example is Mr. Lee. So I already said I want to talk about Mr. Lee. So he started selling fridges in the 1980s. So, and then after a while, because he had always the dream to do something with cars, he started to making motorbikes, this kind of scooter type of motorbikes. And then he always had the dream to make cars. And after a while, he made a lot of money with this, and he had a good cash flow. He said, I'm going to make cars in the end of the 1990s. And everybody thought he was crazy, because it's not easy to make cars. And he said, well, but I know how to make motorbikes. So, it's 4 wheels and then a roof, and then you have a car. So it's not difficult. So he always had the idea, I'm going to make cars. And then he didn't get a lot of support, and he couldn't find even the license to produce the cars. Because you need a license to produce cars, right? Because it's safety and everything on the road and so on. So he found a very interesting way. He said, I can either wait 3 years and spend, I don't know, an X billion amount of money in building up the facility, which is very slow. I mean, who wants to wait 3 years? Or find another way. And he found another way. It was very interesting. So he actually bought a license from a prison. Like prisons, they sometimes have factories where prison workers would build things. In some cases, those things are trucks that go on construction sites. Because in some cases, prisons would have licenses to make trucks. So he went around the province in Zhejiang and he said, can I find this? And he found one, and he used that license to start producing cars. And then, of course, the government is not crazy. They said, well, this is the wrong license. But at the same time, they were like, now we're stuck with American cars and Japanese cars and German cars. So if he succeeds, it's nice to have a Chinese car, a Chinese branded car. And if he doesn't succeed, we can always blame him, right? Because he violated the rule. And that's typical Chinese government. Typical Chinese government. Wait and see what happens, and we regulate afterwards. So, and if something goes wrong in the process, it's a pity, but it's the cost of experimentation and progress. But we regulate afterwards. In Holland, it's the other way around. We first regulate, then we discuss, then we regulate again, then we kill the business, and then we say, now you try. So this is really very different mindset. It's very interesting. So and then they launched his first car, very ugly. Very ugly. And nobody liked the car, to be honest. And then Mr. Lee said, there was an interview with a journalist, and he said, he asked Mr. Lee, said, why do you launch this ugly car? And then he said, are you not afraid of your reputation? And Mr. Lee said, yeah, I didn't know that I had a reputation for making cars. I said, I don't know, so there was nothing to lose, right? So, and then he said, oh, yeah. And he said, no, I want you to tell me, what's wrong with it? So do you think the color's not good? Or is it not safe enough? Is the engine too small? Or you want bigger wheels? Or you tell me as a user what you want. So this is at the early 2000s. So by 2010, so if you count, that is like 8 or 9 years later, they were a brand big enough to make cars that look like this. It's on. But it's not moving. Yeah, okay. Cars that look like this, and actually acquired Volvo. And acquiring Volvo was not only about buying the company, huh? So it's of course you can buy a company, but the key thing is that you want to use the technology and knowledge and use that to improve your own cars. So if your own level of technology is not good enough, you can buy whatever you want, but it's going to be useless. So within a very short period of time, they developed enough capability to be able to absorb that knowledge, build nicer cars, and actually become one of the larger players in the originally the lower end, but today in the middle end of the market. So this is a car that I would buy. Now, the story didn't stop there, because he also knew that in China he cannot stop thinking about what's the next thing. Yeah. So he knew that electric vehicles and all kinds of other connected cars were going to be the standard. So he started also to develop, oh, this is going to be difficult, huh? Yeah. All kinds of partnerships, in fact, all kinds of very strange partnerships, just to deliver any type of service and solution in the car that he could not make. So he said, instead of building myself a software capability in-house, I'm just going to partner with everybody to be able to deliver that connected service and all the software that people want in the car today. So very interesting, he kept reinventing himself. And if you think about this story, it's very typical for Chinese entrepreneurs. Keep reinventing themselves, having a vision, a big vision, tinkering towards this vision and seeing whatever works and trying to get there. And that works even in a complex industry like the car industry. So I think I wanted to share this short story with you, because I think it's very typical for the Chinese mindset. So now we go to the next slide. So hidden vision and the hidden champions, and these companies already basically told you the story. These underdogs, which I think for me are the more interesting group, I want to give you a couple of examples, because otherwise you walk away without examples of this group. So for instance, one is the company I just mentioned. It's called CUBO. So it's a former NASA scientist, PhD in geosatellite imaging, and he came back to China with this idea to optimize land use for farming. And China has this problem that there's a lot of small farms. So it's not big farms, but a lot of small farms. So it's very difficult to optimize across the different farms. So he started to do that, and over time he zoomed in deeper into farms, of livestock farms, in this case pigs. And he used the technology of satellite imaging and combined it with artificial intelligence, computer vision, and he started to track pigs. So, and at the moment the technology goes one level further, where he will scan the face of a pig, or how you call that, so to identify individually each pig and track the movement, measure that and connect it to the movement of the satellite, how quick the pig moves in the farm, to estimate whether or not it's ill, needs to eat less, eat more, if the humidity is high or too low, all kinds of interesting things. It sounds boring, but you can imagine agriculture is a big business in China. So another example is a company called Royal in Shenzhen. So I think somebody of you visited Shenzhen before. So again, PhD from I think it was Stanford, first from Tsinghua, then from Stanford, and came back to China in a field called thin film display. And they actually developed the world's thinnest thin film. So this film is 0.01 millimeter thick, and it's a color touchscreen. So can you imagine it's like a foil. So the idea, the vision is that you put it on on any kind of surface, like a t-shirt or on a car dashboard, and it's basically all, touchscreen display. Now, of course, the difficulty with this is it's difficult to produce this, at high quantity, high quality in mass production. So what they said in between, before we reached that vision, we're not going to wait 10 years or 15 years, we built other things. So they started to do things with slightly less thin film displays, and that's this foldable phone. So they actually launched the world's first foldable phone, and it doesn't break. And the Samsung one breaks when you do this 3 times, but this one doesn't. So, and I know that I've used it, I know the founder, I know the co-founder, so it's not a joke, it's real. But his final vision is not this. His final vision is actually industrial use, displays that you can use for all kinds of foldable applications. But then a typical way for an underdog is to say, well, we have now this technology, first let's get something out. Make sure that we get something out there. We make money because we can sell this. Then maybe we can use that money to get into what we eventually want to do. So sometimes we see these Chinese products like the robots, the little dancing robots. We think, it's very silly. But it's not silly. It's very clever. It is a way to monetize the technology before reaching your final vision of an actual, human-like robot, or in his case, a very fantastic application of super thin film display. And that's a very Chinese mindset. Now the last ones you can read about yourself. These are all in the news. Didi, TikTok, all of these famous companies, but they're interesting. They're interesting because they use this digital technology, they reach high speed, and they are ultimately obsessed with the user. So, and that's to the extent that they don't care to make money or to make profit or revenues at this stage. And it's interesting. And these are the type of companies that multinationals have problems with because they know the customer better than the multinational who has done it for 150 years. They know it better in 1 year time because they better know how to leverage digital technology to get closer to the consumer. So only for that reason, this is an interesting group. So, the picture, for me, is like what's it called? Ice mountain? Iceberg, right? So, forgive my English. So, we see something on the top, which is maybe like 30 or 40 famous big companies that do well, but there's a lot more underwater. And I think that for me, the next 10 years, the next 20 years of innovation from China is going to come from what is under the water. And obviously, as you indicated, not all of these companies are going to be successful. Not all of the companies are going to succeed or going to become big companies. But they're going to play a role all across. And all across meaning all across industries, across countries. So we can worry about safety issues and backdoors in the Huawei network. But the reality is, all the other components and technologies that are around there, a lot of these are already Chinese technologies or will be Chinese technologies in the future. And for me, that's a good thing. I don't think it's a bad thing. It means opportunities to collaborate, opportunities to invest, opportunities to move forward the technology boundary towards something that we can use in society and to improve our lives. I don't think it's a bad thing, but it is something that we need to keep in mind. Because that is going to challenge the way we do things in other parts of the world. It's also going to be inspiring because it will teach us to really think about the customer first. And that sometimes we can, based on a technology, we can still make money. Or how can we use digital technology better to get closer to the customer? I think there's a lot of lessons in there as well. There's also a lot of threats in there. So I think with that I would like to stop here because I think this probably means I'm out of time. So I'm sure there's other questions we can discuss a bit more. Thank you very much.